The grandfather walked miles in the rain to bring water to his sick granddaughter. But when he arrived and saw a well-dressed man step out of a black car, his world fell apart. The sun had risen early, spreading its first rays over the parched fields surrounding the town. The land looked cracked, and the plants, with wilted leaves, struggled to survive amid a drought that seemed endless. Ezekiel, a man with grey hair and rough hands from years of labor, slowly inspected the furrows of his small farm. He observed the fissures opening like scars in the earth and felt tightness in his chest upon confirming that the well contained only a last thread of water. His animals too were weak and showed little inclination to move, aware there wouldn't be enough water for everyone. As he headed to the local store, Ezekiel noticed the discouraged murmuring of his neighbors. No one was escaping the drought's impact. The crops weren't thriving, vegetables dried up before maturing, and the lack of water made even the simplest tasks difficult. In every conversation, the same question arose: how much longer could the town survive under such conditions? Each day seemed to dawn with the same fleeting hope. Maybe today it would rain. Inside the store, Beatrice, a woman of around 40, furrowed her brow while checking the inventory of her modest restaurant. She was well known for her entrepreneurial spirit, but now she hardly had any customers. Her savings were dwindling rapidly, forcing her to reduce portions and change the menu to adapt to the shortage of supplies. Even so, she never completely lost her smile, and as she served Ezekiel, she whispered that it was becoming harder to convince patrons to sit down for a meal, since many preferred to save their money during the crisis. That same day, just a few blocks away, Mayor Matthew Johnson was holding a private meeting in his office. Rumor had it that investors had arrived with ambitious plans. Word on the street was they were looking for large tracts of land for a tourism project, though no one knew anything for sure. Matthew had won the elections promising progress. Some considered him honest, while others distrusted his motives. Quietly, people were saying something shady was being cooked up behind those closed doors. Meanwhile, at Ezekiel's house, little Alice, only 8 years old, busied herself with simple chores. Her face displayed a contagious happiness, despite the daily struggle for water. That morning, she had lit the kitchen fire with damp wood, battling to keep the flames alive, then swept the floor with a worn-out broom that barely had a few bristles left. Ezekiel watched her tenderly, aware that although the girl wasn't his blood granddaughter, he had felt she was ever since he took her into his arms years ago. While Alice finished sweeping the patio, she paused to watch the dry leaves swaying in the hot wind. Her gaze reflected an innocence that contrasted with the harshness of the environment. Unknowingly, she was the one reminding Ezekiel that, despite the difficult times, it was worth pressing on. He picked up a container with the last of the water in a clay vessel and carried it to where the chickens were, trying not to waste a single drop. With each step, he felt the weight of responsibility to keep the child healthy, to protect her from the precarious situation hanging over the entire town. By late afternoon, the heat refused to relent, and shadows stretched over the dusty streets. People shut their doors early, not only to avoid the stifling heat, but also due to the mistrust stemming from the possible sale of land. Despite the worries, a peaceful atmosphere lingered in Ezekiel's humble home. Alice, seated on a small wooden stool, played with a rag doll he had made for her long ago. The old man watched her for a moment, promising himself he would do whatever it took to care for her. As night fell, the stars appeared, beautiful and indifferent to the town's suffering. From her restaurant, Beatrice wiped the tables with a damp cloth and sighed, noticing the lack of customers. In the distance, the mayor's office remained lit, suggesting the meeting with the investors was dragging on longer than expected. Unbeknownst to the townspeople, they stood on the cusp of events that would transform their lives. And in the midst of that arid, expectant atmosphere, Alice smiled with the pure joy of childhood, not realizing how much her world would change in the coming days. That day, from dawn onward, the heat felt even more intense than usual. The sun rose over the town's dusty rooftops without a hint of mercy, and the gusts of scorching wind amplified the sense of dryness. In Ezekiel's humble home, Alice began her chores as if everything were normal. She fed the chickens and cleaned the small corridor. However, by mid-morning, she placed a hand on her forehead and paused for a moment, feeling a slight dizziness that made her lean against the wall. Ezekiel, busy examining an old sack of feed for his animals, noticed the sudden silence in the yard and approached the girl. He saw that Alice's gaze was unfocused and she was breathing hard. When he asked what was wrong, she answered in a trembling voice that she felt tingling in her hands and a strange vertigo. Accustomed to the girl's toughness, the old man frowned upon finding her forehead hotter than usual. Concerned, he sat her on a small stool and tried to give her some water, but only a few drops remained in the canteen. The water shortage had become so severe that every sip felt like a luxury. Alice drank slowly, though the relief was brief. Minutes later, her hands started shaking, and her face grew pale. Alarmed by these unsettling signs, Ezekiel decided not to wait any longer and carried her to the town's tiny clinic. The local doctor, an elderly man with wrinkled hands and thick glasses, greeted them with a grave expression. He was used to treating common ailments like colds or minor injuries, but upon seeing Alice's fever, he couldn't hide his concern. After laying her on a wobbly cot, he checked her temperature and vital signs. "You'll need to make sure she drinks lots of water and rests," the doctor warned, as he placed an old-fashioned thermometer under the girl's arm. "I suspect she needs antibiotics, but hydration is essential." Ezekiel felt a knot in his throat when he heard these words. The recommendation to drink clean water seemed a cruel paradox in a place where the liquid was becoming scarcer and more expensive every day. On top of that, buying special medication posed a serious financial challenge. Even so, he thanked the doctor and promised to do everything possible to follow his advice. When Alice managed to stand up, the doctor gave her a couple of pills to reduce the fever and recommended rest. With anxiety etched on his face, Ezekiel led the girl back home. On the way, they stopped at Beatrice's store, where she noticed Alice's pallor with a mix of surprise and sadness. She offered to make a nourishing broth, although she confessed that without customers, it was growing harder to cover her restaurant's basic expenses. Ezekiel thanked her and hurried home to let the girl lie down as soon as possible. By nightfall, Alice's exhaustion became more evident. The old man settled her on his modest bed, placing a damp cloth on her forehead to help with the fever. While the girl dozed, Ezekiel sat in a chair, lost in grim thoughts. Ever since the drought had taken hold of the town, he'd feared for Alice's health. Now, that concern had come true, and doubt swirled through his mind about how to obtain enough potable water. In the midst of that tension, Beatrice arrived with a bowl of steaming broth. Her eyes showed her own weariness. In a subdued voice, she confided her financial fears. Every day without customers increased her debts, and her small business was on the brink. Ezekiel listened in silence, understanding that every family in town was fighting its own battle during that period of scarcity. Then they both sipped the broth and prayed for the girl's swift recovery and for the drought to end. Darkness enveloped the town. Almost at the same time, a hot breeze drifted through the streets without leaving any trace of moisture. While Ezekiel and Beatrice made the sign of the cross in the small living room, Alice slept, breathing restlessly, unaware of what the illness had in store for her. After some prayers, Beatrice left with the promise of returning the next day to help however she could. Alone in the peeling walled house, Ezekiel remained watching the girl in silence. The soft glow of a kerosene lamp lit Alice's feverish features, and a chill ran down the old man's spine as he contemplated life's fragility and the mysteries surrounding the child's origins. That night, his fatigue wouldn't let him fall asleep easily. Deep down, he sensed that the difficulties were only beginning, and that he would need to gather his strength to face a storm that might not bring rain, but rather a series of trials, testing his hope and his love for the girl. The ceaseless hum of cars and the rush of crowds defined the city where Andrew Brown lived. The towering buildings and neon lights contrasted sharply with the calm image of that distant town where drought and water scarcity reigned mercilessly. In an elegant apartment in the financial district, Andrew spent his afternoons poring over dusty documents and newspaper clippings stored in a leather folder. Beside him, frowning with pen in hand, sat Diego, his lawyer and trusted friend since their college days. Diego flipped through yellowed files, marking any potentially relevant details with a ballpoint pen. Most referred to a disappearance that took place 8 years earlier, when Andrew's daughter, still a baby, vanished from the family's radar. The child's mother, weighed down by personal fears and insecurities, had run away one night without leaving any clues, taking the little one with her. Since then, Andrew had lived with an emptiness no professional success could ever fill. Every clue that surfaced ended in a dead end, yet he never gave up. That afternoon, Andrew's cell phone rang with such a sharp tone that it made him jump. He answered anxiously, expecting another baseless rumor, but this time he heard a measured, serious voice on the other end of the line. An anonymous caller claimed to have seen a girl with a peculiar mark on her arm, identical to the one in the few photographs Andrew still kept of his daughter. The caller mentioned a remote town ravaged by drought, a place not found on tourist maps. After hanging up, Andrew's heart pounded with renewed hope. He couldn't dismiss the possibility that this might be the same child he had been searching for all these years. Excitement washed over him as he relayed the news to Diego. The lawyer, keeping his composure, weighed the risks and the source's reliability. Too often they had chased tenuous leads. Even so, both agreed it was worth investigating right away. If there was the slightest chance that this girl was Andrew's missing daughter, he couldn't afford to ignore it. His determination, long held in check, now pulsed through him like a call to action. That same day, when Andrew arrived home, Caroline, his partner and soon-to-be wife, greeted him with a look of uncertainty. He had long since confided in her about his lost daughter, assuring her that he would never stop searching. But with their wedding drawing near, Caroline feared that finding the child would upend all their plans. Though she didn't say it aloud, she was uneasy about how this new addition might alter the dynamics of their relationship and the future they'd dreamed of. Still, Caroline didn't dare openly oppose him. She knew the pain Andrew had carried since losing his daughter and understood the depth of that emptiness in his heart. Without reproach, she offered her help with whatever he might need for the investigation, even as lingering doubts gnawed at her chest. Andrew, grateful, pulled her into a tight embrace. For the first time in a long while, it felt as though the horizon was coming into focus. That evening, he retreated to his personal study, a soberly furnished room overflowing with books and legal files about the case. Under the soft glow of a desk lamp, he took out a photo battered by years of handling, the image of a baby smiling innocently, with a birthmark on her left arm. That small mark remained his most concrete clue for identifying her. He stared at it, a lump in his throat, and once again asked himself what had become of the child's mother, why she had chosen to vanish without explanation, and whether she was still alive somewhere. Lost in thought, Andrew remembered all the days he'd spent glued to the telephone, calling private detectives and search agencies. Every time a fresh glimmer of hope appeared, he pursued it, even at the cost of neglecting both his business and personal life. More than once he discovered that the leads were false or matched other families with similar situations. Still, he had never given up. Now, buoyed by this new ray of light, he considered traveling as soon as possible to the remote place the unknown voice had mentioned. Before midnight, Diego called to confirm that he had checked the credibility of the tip. Apparently, the informant had some legitimacy and precise details about a town suffering an extreme drought. Convinced by this verification, they agreed to plan a trip as soon as they could. Andrew felt a whirlwind of emotions, nerves at the possibility of reuniting with his daughter, and a profound longing to fill the void in his heart that had ached for so many years. By the time he finally switched off the lamp, he realized it was already 1 in the morning. Holding the baby's picture in his hand, he studied the features that, if the tip proved true, could guide him to the child's fate. He whispered a brief prayer, asking to discover the truth, no matter how painful or shocking it might be. In that moment, he decided that, come what may, he would follow this lead through to the end. If the girl turned out to be his daughter, nothing and no one would stop him from bringing her back. And if not, he would at least know he had done everything possible to find the little one taken from his arms so long ago. The sky dawned with a different shade, as if the grey clouds had resolved to come to the rescue after months of relentless sunshine. In the deep cracks lining the fields around the town, there was a collective anticipation of potential rain. Ezekiel, noticing the shadow beginning to stretch across the ground, placed a hand on his hat brim and squinted to make sure he wasn't imagining it. He'd heard in Beatrice's store about a nearby storm, and that morning the cool breeze seemed to confirm it. Feeling a slight stir of hope, Ezekiel remembered an old spring at the foot of a nearby hill. According to the oldest residents' memories, it only poured crystal-clear water when the rainy season set in fully. Ever since he was a boy, he had learned to read certain signs in the sky: the shapes of clouds, the wind's direction, even the color of the sunset, clues that hinted at approaching storms. So he thought it might be worth venturing out if enough rain fell. From that source, perhaps he could get the clean water he so desperately needed for Alice. The girl, however, remained in fragile condition. Her fever persisted, and the trembling in her hands that had started days before now struck in ever shorter intervals. The local doctor visited her at dawn with a grave expression, remarking that if she didn't improve, the wisest course would be to transfer her to a city hospital. Ezekiel, his shoulders tense and his spirit heavy, heard the recommendation. He had no proper means of transportation, nor the money for a long hospital stay. Besides, the trip itself would take hours over dirt roads that, with heavy rain, could become impassable. While Ezekiel kept watch over the girl, the first timid raindrops began to fall onto the rooftops. At first, the gentle sound of rain aroused the curiosity of the townspeople. Some stepped onto their porches with containers in hand, eager to gather water if the rainfall became heavier. In her restaurant, Beatrice ordered her lone employee to find buckets and collect all the water possible. A mix of relief and urgency permeated the air. No one knew if the downpour would last long enough to make a real difference. In Mayor Matthew Johnson's office, the news of the storm was welcomed with a satisfied grin. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a meticulously groomed moustache, he rubbed his hands together while examining a document on his desk. Now that water was finally falling, he could show the investors a less dusty landscape, convincing them that the area wasn't as doomed by drought as they feared. If the deal went through, Matthew stood to reap a considerable personal benefit, although it might not be nearly as favorable for the local farmers. They feared this tourist development project would become a threat to their land. Outside the mayor's inner circle, nobody knew the details of those negotiations. Rumors swirled, but no official statement had been released. The truth was that the rain's arrival boosted the chances of closing the deal. While the wind rattled the windows of his office, Matthew cast quick glances at his documents, calculating how much he could now demand from the tourism company under these improved conditions. To him, the storm was a golden opportunity to show off land that had, until recently, looked too arid to be profitable. Meanwhile, at Ezekiel's house, the atmosphere contrasted sharply with the euphoria at City Hall. The old man observed Alice with a knitted brow, his heart clenching at her feverish face. He placed one hand over hers to check how hot she was. Despite her weakness, Alice offered a faint smile when she heard the raindrops pattering on the roof. She wanted to believe that this rain signaled the end of her suffering and that the aches she felt would soon vanish with a good sip of fresh water. Ezekiel, trying to spark his own optimism, thought of that spring that would flow if the rain held steady. If the downpour became torrential, he could fill a few containers and make the journey, hoping that his adoptive granddaughter might recover. The doctor had prescribed rest and constant hydration, and the medicine would only help if they secured water free of the sediment and bacteria common in the town's few water sources. With no money for a hospital trip and time running out, this plan seemed their only viable option. By nightfall, the storm had gathered force. The clouds unleashed a heavier rain, and the light tapping turned into a loud drumming against tin roofs and the cobblestones of the small central square. While many locals cautiously celebrated the gift from the skies, Alice slept fitfully, cold sweat beading her forehead. Ezekiel, seated beside her, watched the gale from the window and silently prayed for divine mercy, that the rain might quench not only the land's thirst, but also heal the fragility of the girl he loved so dearly. The rain hammered relentlessly on the rusted metal roofs as Ezekiel decided the moment had arrived. Thunder ripped through the nighttime hush, and each lightning flash briefly illuminated the puddles forming in the dusty streets. Alice, exhausted by fever, had drifted into a restless sleep. Beatrice offered to stay at her bedside, ready to call the local doctor if her condition took a turn for the worse. They knew that, under such circumstances, having clean water was crucial. Clutching 2 empty jugs, Ezekiel set off toward the spring outside town. Crossing the threshold, he was met by a howling wind that whirled dry leaves and debris through the darkness. Mud was already forming underfoot, making each step more challenging. Even so, he felt the storm was on his side. After so many months of drought, this downpour was the single realistic hope of finding the spring flowing abundantly. He pressed on with resolve, hugging the jugs close. He was soaked within moments, but the discomfort didn't deter him. His gaze, locked on the path, revealed the determination of a man who wouldn't give up as long as the child's life hung in the balance. As he trudged forward, the squelch of his boots in the mud brought back memories of the night he found Alice. He recalled only fragments, hazy like a half-faded dream. He remembered standing by a riverbank, in a darkness lit only by the moon. A faint cry alerted him that something was amiss. Moving cautiously toward the sound of rushing water, he spotted a small bundle on the wet grass. Drawing closer, he discovered a baby just a few months old, wrapped in blankets heavy with dampness. Looking toward the nearby bridge, he glimpsed the distant lights of a car speeding away, offering no explanation at all. That distant night, Ezekiel's heart raced as he held the little one in his arms. He never knew what moved him more, the trembling of the baby, who seemed hungry and frightened, or the thought that someone had abandoned her. He brought her home and spent the first hours drying her off and wrapping her in his old blanket. The next day, he notified the local authorities, but no one ever found concrete information about her parents. And so, over time, that child became the daughter fate had not given him. Whenever Alice asked about her origins, he would sigh and offer her a loving smile, avoiding any detail of how she ended up in his life. That stormy night, as Ezekiel tried not to slip in the mud, he felt again that blend of tenderness and sadness that always accompanied him when he recalled the girl's abandonment. He wondered how things might have turned out if nobody had left her to her fate. Maybe Alice would be living somewhere else, with comforts and without sickness. Yet that thought didn't diminish his love or determination to keep caring for her. He knew the child was his responsibility, and in some way belonged to him too. That was why each step toward the spring was an act of faith in saving her. On a particularly muddy stretch, Ezekiel lost his balance and fell onto his side. A sharp pain shot through his shoulder as he hit the ground. For a few seconds, he lay there, the rain blinding him as the drops soaked his face. A lightning flash lit up the scene, revealing the murky puddle around his legs. He forced himself to stand, gritting his teeth against the stab of pain in his arm. Checking on his jugs, now covered in mud, he made sure they were still intact. He couldn't afford to lose or break them. They were the only means of transporting the water he so desperately needed. Body aching and pulse pounding, he pushed on for nearly an hour. Every so often, he oriented himself by looking for an old power pole or a twisted tree he knew by heart, even in the darkness. At last, after skirting a rocky outcrop, he reached the clearing where the spring usually emerged. The roar of the rain mingled with the gurgling of water spilling down the slope. In that moment, Ezekiel felt a chill of relief. The spring was there, overflowing with crystal-clear water that, thanks to the downpour, was pouring vigorously among the stones. He hurried to fill his jugs, rinsing his hands in the process to remove the mud and keep the water as clean as possible. He had to be careful so the current wouldn't sweep the containers away. Once they were full, he paused a moment to take in the scene. The rush of the water, falling in torrents, mixed with his ragged breathing. He thought of Alice, feverish and weak, waiting for him. These jugs held the best chance of hydrating her and easing her fever before it was too late. With one last glance at the spring, Ezekiel gathered up the jugs and began the return journey. Though his shoulder hurt and he was drenched to the bone, the knowledge that Alice was waiting for him in bed gave him the courage he needed to keep going. Each step carried him closer to saving the child he had found in the darkness one night and whom he had loved as his own ever since. That stormy night, amid thunder and lightning, Ezekiel showed the determination of a heart that refused to surrender. The rain continued to pound the rooftops with unusual force when Andrew Brown arrived in the small town, exhausted from the journey, accompanied by his lawyer Diego and his fiancée Caroline. The road leading there had become a torment, as the normally dusty paths were now full of puddles and mud because of the storm. They traveled in a rented SUV that at times skidded dangerously on the flooded stretches. Seated in the passenger seat, Andrew occasionally consulted an outdated map, making sure they were still on the right route. When at last they spotted the first houses, they found themselves on narrow, waterlogged streets, lit only by a few dim lanterns. Diego, who had been quietly reviewing documents for much of the trip, sighed in relief upon seeing signs of life. Wasting no time, Andrew looked for a place they could stay and recalled the tip he'd received about a modest restaurant that also rented rooms. Following those directions, the three of them stepped out of the SUV in front of a humble building with walls battered by the region's harsh weather. Beatrice, the owner of that restaurant, appeared in the doorway to greet them. Despite the storm and the fatigue she felt from a lack of customers, she maintained a friendly demeanor, though she couldn't hide a slight wariness in her gaze. She noticed Caroline's fine clothes and Andrew's dignified bearing, unspoiled by his evident exhaustion. Diego, a bit more relaxed, greeted her with a courteous nod. Beatrice showed them the empty dining room, then led them to the small reception area where she usually recorded the bills of the few patrons who came by. There, she placed an old registry book on the counter for them to sign. "It's not common to receive visitors at this hour," she remarked, handing them a pen. "Even less so in the middle of a storm like this." Soaking wet, Andrew nodded politely and explained that the trip had taken longer than expected because of the road conditions. They needed somewhere to stay and, above all, some information. Beatrice offered them a couple of simple rooms with clean beds and enough blankets to keep them warm in the damp weather. Noticing that the rain hadn't let up and sensing her guests' tension, however, she ventured to ask if there was anything they needed right away. Before Andrew could reply, the restaurant door flew open, letting in a burst of wind and rain. In walked the town's mayor, Matthew Johnson, wearing a drenched trench coat and bearing a self-satisfied smile. He was already aware a wealthy visitor had arrived, a rumor that had spread through the streets. Eager to seize the opportunity, the mayor strode up to Andrew, hand extended, introducing himself in a tone that mingled hospitality with calculation. "Welcome. I heard you had a rough journey," Matthew said, displaying a certain eloquence. "If you need guidance, I'm at your service. Our town has much to offer, especially regarding tourism investments." Andrew, mud clinging to his shoes, took a moment to observe the mayor. It only took him that short pause to sense Matthew's focus on profit rather than humanitarian concerns. So, with politeness, He thanked the mayor for the greeting, but quickly clarified that his visit had no business purpose. He was here for personal reasons. Unruffled, Matthew took every conversational pause to mention a possible tourist development project that, he claimed, would revitalize the region and benefit the local people. Neither Andrew's serious expression nor Caroline's uneasy silence seemed to discourage him. Meanwhile, Beatrice, still attentive to the conversation, couldn't help noticing the briefcase Diego carried under his arm, from which a few papers protruded. It wasn't common in that town to see such well-organized documents, especially in a place where paper was scarce and people did their bookkeeping in battered ledgers. Subtly, the restaurant owner offered hot drinks to ward off the chill of the rain, taking advantage of the moment to ask what personal matter had brought Andrew there. That was when he, with a mix of caution and determination, mentioned what had led him to this remote corner. He was searching for a little girl who had disappeared 8 years ago, a child with an unmistakable birthmark on her left arm. Beatrice felt a surge of alarm. She remembered Alice, the girl Ezekiel looked after so diligently, whose health had worsened in recent weeks. She knew Alice had a distinctive mark on her arm, though she had never asked the old man for details. The thought that this sickly girl might be the same child Andrew was seeking made her throat tighten. She knew Ezekiel loved the girl dearly and protected her almost paternally. If she turned out to be the same little one, the consequences could be unpredictable. Excusing herself, Beatrice stepped away to the kitchen, leaving the newcomers with Matthew, who still hadn't missed a chance to promote his progress plan. Diego, acting in his capacity as a lawyer, quickly caught on to the mayor's angle and questioned him pointedly about the legality of his intended transactions. As for Andrew, he wanted only to rest, yet at the same time felt a pressing urge to get out and investigate the town to verify whether the lead that had brought him there was real. Caroline, tense, kept quiet, uneasy about the enormity of whatever they might discover. Thus, as the storm continued unabated and under Beatrice's watchful eye, the visitors settled into the modest rooms, unaware that each drop of rain brought them closer to the moment when Alice's secret would be at risk. Meanwhile, Ezekiel had yet to return from the spring, and the girl still lay resting, unaware that the man who might change her life had arrived in town at precisely the right time. The storm had not let up when Ezekiel, exhausted and coated in mud, finally appeared at the doorway of his humble house. Every step sent pain through the shoulder he had injured on his grueling trek to the spring, but his resolve to save Alice spurred his every movement. With difficulty, he set down the 2 jugs filled with water near the small table by the girl's bed. Alice, cheeks aflame with fever, lay beneath a tattered blanket, trembling with faint spasms. She opened her eyes for just an instant upon sensing Ezekiel's presence, but was unable to focus on the old man's face before drifting off again, overcome by exhaustion. Ezekiel knelt carefully beside her, ignoring the pain in his shoulder and the weight of his drenched clothes clinging to him. "Easy, child," he murmured, trying to keep his voice steady. "I brought clean water. You'll feel better soon." Beatrice's footsteps echoed in the hallway. She had been listening for the slightest sign that Ezekiel was back. Seeing him in such bad shape, she ran over to steady him so he wouldn't collapse. The old man nodded in gratitude, his rough hands gripping one of the jugs, while Beatrice helped scrape the worst of the mud off his boots. A few minutes later, the local doctor entered with his battered medical bag. A man of calm mannerisms, he nonetheless conveyed weariness and concern. He approached Alice, took her pulse, and checked her burning forehead. Then he examined the water Ezekiel had brought, needing to be sure it was fit for the girl to drink. On confirming its purity, the doctor allowed himself a small smile of relief. "This water should help bring her fever down," he announced. "Plus, with a course of antibiotics and rest, she'll likely improve in a few days." Ezekiel felt an immense weight lift from him when he heard those words. He explained to the doctor how he had gotten the water, sparing no detail about the fall and the arduous journey. The doctor insisted on examining him as well, fearing the blow to his shoulder might be serious. Yet Ezekiel asked that Alice be treated first with the necessary medications. If anything was complicated with him, he would wait until he was sure the girl was stable. While the old man offered Alice small sips of the cold water in a metal cup, Beatrice, looking worried, approached to share news she had learned that afternoon. She told him that some visitors from the city had arrived in town, a man with a well-to-do appearance, his elegant partner, and a lawyer. What upset her was the reason for their visit. "They say they're looking for a girl who disappeared many years ago, one who supposedly has a birthmark," she murmured, avoiding Ezekiel's gaze. Ezekiel's reaction was immediate. A tight knot seized his throat. Just thinking that someone might come to take Alice from him made his stomach churn. He didn't know who the girl's real parents were, but he had spent years fearing that someone would suddenly appear to claim her. Though that fear had always been vague and distant, now it was real. In a hoarse voice, he asked, "Did they mention anything else? Any names? Or if they know where this child they're looking for is supposed to be?" Beatrice shook her head, confessing that all she knew was of their arrival and the strange question about a birthmark. From the way the man spoke, he seemed to have resources and influence, likely able to open any door he wanted. Ezekiel glanced at Alice, who was dozing, her expression momentarily relaxed thanks to those first sips of water. He had no intention of disturbing her with the dread now gnawing at him. Gently stroking her hair, he whispered, "Don't worry, my little one. I'm here. Nothing and no one will harm you." As rain continued thundering on the roof, he faced a tumult of inner conflict. He worried about the girl's health, but also the lingering threat posed by wealthy strangers armed with documents and unknown motives. His greatest anguish was not knowing if Alice would be safe or if someone would try to tear her away from him. Even so, he forced himself to keep calm, reminding himself that his priority was to stabilize the girl, give her the care she needed, and only then confront the visitors with the truth in hand. That night ended with a dim light in Alice's room, while Ezekiel remained vigilant. The hard-won water gave the feverish child some relief, and time ticked toward an inevitable meeting. Though fear coiled tight in his chest, Ezekiel refused to surrender. If that city man had come intending to claim the girl, he would find a steadfast barrier ready to defend her. Barely at daybreak, Andrew, led by Matthew, made his way through the flooded streets of the town, determined to find Ezekiel's house. Caroline and Diego followed in silence, sensing the tension hanging over the group. The storm had left puddles behind, and the muggy air warned of a day full of uncertainty. Walking confidently, Matthew headed up the group, glancing at Andrew now and again, as if hoping to win him over. Yet the city man barely noticed, consumed by the pressing need to confirm the missing child's identity. Humble houses, eroded by the climate, lined the road one after another. Some were sealed up tight, while others had doors left ajar to let out the trapped heat. As they advanced, the clucking of hens and the flow of muddy water broke the early morning hush. Andrew's face showed the mixture of anxiety and determination that had driven him to this remote place. Diego, for his part, kept a firm grip on his briefcase, aware that, as the lawyer, his role could become crucial if the situation turned into a legal dispute. At last, Matthew stopped in front of a small house with time-worn walls. The wooden fence around it was broken in places, and patches of mud covered the yard. Without many words, the mayor indicated that this was Ezekiel's home. Andrew eyed the facade, recognizing the unassuming charm typical of rural life. He wondered if the girl he was searching for might be there and clenched his fists, bracing himself for whatever he might discover. Matthew raised his hand and knocked firmly. Inside, there were slow footsteps, followed by a tense silence. Then the door opened warily, and Ezekiel appeared, a hard expression on his face, his gaze laden with mistrust. He clearly didn't trust strangers at his door, especially if they arrived in the mayor's company. His shoulder showed slight stiffness from his recent fall, yet it didn't stop him from squaring himself like someone guarding a treasure. "What do you want?" Ezekiel demanded in a gruff voice, his eyes lingering on Andrew and then on Caroline, whose refined clothes contrasted starkly with the meager surroundings. Matthew jumped in to answer, gesturing servilely toward Andrew in a show of courtesy. But before he could explain the reason for their visit, Andrew spoke up, unable to repress his urgency any longer. "I need to see the girl," he said seriously. "I've been told the little one I've searched for all these years might be here." Ezekiel did nothing to hide his displeasure. He scowled and shot a suspicious look at Matthew, guessing at once that the mayor was behind the arrival of these outsiders. Without removing his gaze from Andrew, he demanded to know who he was and by what right he barged in like this. "I'm Andrew Brown," Andrew replied firmly. "I'm looking for my missing daughter. She has a birthmark on her left arm. Someone told me a girl with that characteristic lives in this town." At the mention of the birthmark, Ezekiel felt a sudden lurch in his heart. He had dreaded for years the day someone would come for Alice, and now it was happening. With a protective motion, he positioned himself between the strangers and the doorway to the room where the girl was resting. "No one's been looking for a girl here until now, and the only child living with me has no parents claiming her," the old man shot back, refusing to budge. Sensing the tension, Diego stepped in carefully. He explained that the leads they had gathered pointed to this town, and that their sole aim was to confirm if this was Andrew's daughter. Matthew, meanwhile, maintained a practiced smile, wanting to ingratiate himself with everyone, yet not daring to openly contradict Ezekiel. Suddenly, a faint moan came from the next room, followed by a child's voice. Alice had woken, likely startled by the murmuring and raised voices. Heart pounding, Ezekiel turned to check on her, but Andrew took the opportunity to peer into the modest bedroom. There, lying on a bed with threadbare sheets, Alice looked pale and disoriented. As she tried to sit up, the blanket slipped, revealing her left arm. That was when Andrew fixed his gaze on the birthmark. He needed neither DNA tests nor further questions. He recognized that elongated mole he had seen in old baby photos. A stunning mix of emotions flared in his chest, and he stepped forward without thinking. "Stay away from her!" Ezekiel exclaimed, again moving in front of him, his voice choked with anger and fear. "Where were you all these years? Why did you leave her by the river?" Shocked by the accusations, Andrew defended himself just as vehemently, insisting he had never abandoned her. He insisted on his right, as her father, to see the child, blaming the mother, who had vanished, for everything that had happened. Their voices rose in anger. Alice watched the scene with eyes wide, unable to grasp why these people were arguing around her. Standing aside, Caroline felt a growing unease at the confrontation. Never had she imagined their search for the child would erupt into such a direct clash. Outside, the weather seemed to echo the tension within. Thunder rumbled in the distance, hinting that the storm had barely subsided. Breathing hard, Ezekiel stood in Andrew's path like a guardian prepared to do anything to protect the girl he had raised. Andrew, heart pounding, refused to retreat now that he had recognized the daughter he'd believed lost. And so, in an atmosphere charged with accusations and shouts, the first major collision exploded between the man demanding his daughter and the old man who dreaded losing her. Evening fell slowly over the town, draping the streets in a heavy, humid air after the recent rains. Wispy clouds parted to let through the last rays of sunlight. It was at this moment, amid the disturbed silence pierced here and there by distant voices, that Marina, the old housekeeper of the Brown family, arrived with a slight tremor in her hands. Her eyes bore the weight of a secret kept for years, and the fear of revealing it before those who had every right to demand answers. In Ezekiel's humble living room, tension still hung in the air. Andrew kept his eyes on the room where Alice continued to recover. Caroline stood a short distance away, trying to process everything unfolding, while Diego, the lawyer, quietly pored over some papers. Mayor Matthew's face reflected an insatiable curiosity, but he didn't dare intervene openly. Ezekiel, in a voice calmer than he expected, invited Marina to sit and speak her mind freely. Marina took a deep breath before beginning her story. In a trembling voice, she confessed that she had served in the Brown family home for many years, witnessing the conflicts that arose when Alice's mother became pregnant without Andrew's parents' approval. Fear of a social scandal and the family's wrath drove the young mother to make a drastic decision: flee without leaving a trace, taking the baby with her. At that point, Marina paused, noticing how Andrew tensed at every word. She went on to explain that, after leaving, Alice's mother believed she was protecting the girl by keeping her far from familial pressures and from the Browns' control. Yet she also feared being left entirely on her own, with no money or support. In a moment of desperation, she entrusted the child to the care of a stranger, convinced that by doing so, she was giving her a chance to survive, free from the powerful family's interests. Marina clarified that during this time, Andrew had no idea where the mother or the baby were. He hadn't been home when the young woman fled. He was away on family business and learned of the disappearance only upon his return. The confusion grew when the mother never resurfaced. From then on, Andrew had never stopped searching for his daughter, only to run into dead ends time and again, thwarted by a wall of fear and rumors. Ezekiel listened to every word with his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the woman revealing a past unknown to him. The image he'd formed of Andrew as a supposed villain who abandoned the girl began to crack. Although the pain of thinking Alice had been left to her fate still cut deep, he understood that the man sitting just a few meters away wasn't the culprit he had imagined. Andrew felt a lump form in his throat as Marina spoke. He recalled those sleepless nights, wondering where his daughter might be without ever getting an answer. He realized the events that tore the baby from him were more complex than he had assumed, and that Ezekiel, far from being an intruder, had been the savior who took the child in when no one else would care for her. Standing off to the side, Caroline was swept up in a whirl of emotions. On the one hand, she worried about how this reunion would inevitably change her relationship with Andrew and the wedding plans they had cherished. On the other, she couldn't deny her sympathy on seeing Alice's fragility, alongside the guilt and longing Andrew had carried all that time. On the bed, Alice rested with her fever more under control thanks to clean water and medication. Though the argument had upset her hours before, she'd calmed down enough to sleep for a while. Glancing at the girl, Ezekiel and Andrew exchanged a look filled with mutual gratitude. One recognized the other's devotion and bravery, and the other felt relieved to confirm that this old man was no usurper, but rather someone who had done everything in his power to protect the little one. Thus, on that afternoon, laden with revelations, the truth of the past spread out before them all, shedding light on Alice's mother's hidden motives and freeing Andrew from the guilt he had carried for years. As nightfall's shadows descended on the town once more, everyone understood that destiny had drawn them together to mend a wound that had remained open far too long. Yet the future was still uncertain. The child slept in her bed, unaware of the decisions and agreements being forged while her fever slowly subsided. 2 days had passed since Marina revealed the truth about Alice's mother's disappearance and Andrew's ceaseless search. That brief relief the girl had felt, thanks to the clean water and medication, gave way to a new and alarming turn in her health. The fever, which had never entirely vanished, now rose to a worrisome level, and the gentle tremors that had once afflicted her hands evolved into seizures that shook her fragile body. Ezekiel spent sleepless nights seated by the bed where Alice lay. He offered her spoonfuls of water and broth, trying to bring down her temperature with damp cloths on her forehead, but nothing seemed to help. The local doctor, urgently summoned at dawn, frowned deeply after examining the girl. With wrinkled hands, he felt Alice's pulse and sighed, declaring there was no time to lose. She had to be taken to a better-equipped hospital in the nearest city. "We don't have the instruments here to handle such a serious case," the doctor admitted frankly. "If she isn't transferred, we risk the illness becoming irreversible." His words struck Ezekiel like a hammer. With red-rimmed eyes from exhaustion and worry, He categorically refused to be separated from the girl. He knew all too well that this child, whom he had raised since her first cries, now lay between life and death. But the old man had no idea how to pay for a hospital stay or how to cross the bridge, partially destroyed by the storm. Determined to help, Andrew stepped forward. He said he would cover all medical costs, no matter the price. Immediately, Diego offered to handle the necessary arrangements, contacting clinics and ambulances. But they soon collided with a harsh reality. The only reliable route to the city, a bridge spanning a rushing river, had been badly damaged by torrential rains. Local authorities had placed barricades, banning even light vehicles from passing. They were discussing alternatives in Ezekiel's modest living room when Mayor Matthew Johnson appeared with his trademark calculating smile. He adjusted his trench coat, wiped some mud from his boots, and addressed Andrew in a self-important tone. "I hear you need to cross the bridge as soon as possible. You know it's dangerous the way it is," he said, feigning sympathy. "But I could intervene to speed up its repair. I have contacts who can finish the job in no time." Andrew looked up, unable to hide his relief upon hearing that. However, before he could express his thanks, Matthew went on, letting his true intentions slip out. "Naturally, I'd need some collaboration on your part. I've mentioned my tourism project. If you back me so I can get it going as soon as possible, I can guarantee the bridge will be ready in a couple of days." His tone was unmistakable, a form of blackmail exploiting Alice's medical emergency to force a deal that would advance his real estate plans. Diego immediately sensed the tension in the air and frowned in disapproval. Ezekiel, who had been quietly watching until then, burst out in outrage. "How dare you use this child's health as a bargaining chip?" he hissed, his voice taut with anger. "Don't you realize her life is at stake?" Matthew showed no remorse under the accusation, trying to justify it as a mutual favor. In his view, Andrew's endorsement of the tourist complex would secure immediate work on the bridge. To him, it was a legitimate transaction, one where everyone stood to gain. Deeply conflicted, Andrew hesitated. With his daughter in critical condition, anyone might feel compelled to yield in order to save her, no matter how offensive the mayor's proposal might be. Diego watched him closely, fully aware that if Andrew accepted Matthew's conditions, he risked embroiling himself in scandal, or worse, harming the locals who opposed the project. Meanwhile, Ezekiel could not hide his despair at the sight of Alice lying motionless on the bed, forehead burning. The girl began convulsing again, startling everyone in the room. The local doctor sprang into action, trying to steady her, but his limited resources were quickly overwhelmed. Clearly, medicine and cool water were no longer enough. "We've got to get her out of here right now," the doctor cried out, trying to restrain the child's violent trembling. Caroline hurried to Andrew's side, gripping his arm. She shared his anguish and understood that refusing to cooperate with Matthew might cost Alice her life, but agreeing would mean handing the town's future over to a plan no one had explained openly. Silence weighed on them all, broken only by the sick child's gasping and Ezekiel's hushed protest, for he could neither bear to lose Alice nor see the town forced to bend to the mayor's whim. In that moral dilemma, caught between the urgent need for medical transport and a worthless bridge, the determination to save the girl clashed against Matthew's blackmail. As the old wall clock ticked away the hours, each passing minute further narrowed Alice's chances of surviving without specialized care, pushing everyone toward a desperate solution. In the days after Matthew's ultimatum, tension in the town continued to rise. News of Alice's worsening illness mingled with ever louder rumors about the mayor's real intentions. In the modest kitchen of her restaurant, Beatrice listened to the few customers who ventured in for a hot meal. Many fumed upon hearing that Matthew planned to sell large tracts of land to a tourism company, from which, rumors said, he stood to receive a hefty commission. People feared the project wouldn't actually save them, but would be a death sentence for those who depended on farming and herding. Several townsfolk recalled past promises of development that never materialized. Now, saddled with drought and mounting debts, few believed a mega tourism venture would truly improve their lives. On the contrary, word spread that anyone refusing to sell their land would end up isolated or pressured to abandon the town. Concerned about her dwindling clientele, Beatrice realized she wasn't the only one at risk. Once Alice's condition worsened and the mayor hinted at speeding up bridge repairs in exchange for Andrew's signature, the townspeople began putting two and two together. They understood that Matthew was exploiting the child's urgent needs to force a decision favoring his own interests over the welfare of the community. Feeling uneasy about his tactics, many neighbors started gathering in Beatrice's restaurant for quiet, informal meetings to discuss their options. In one of those gatherings, Diego, the lawyer accompanying Andrew, decided to attend in order to hear the people's concerns firsthand. Beatrice offered him a corner of the kitchen that also served as a storage room where a few neighbors gathered. There, an older woman declared that Matthew had been buying up small plots of land at ridiculously low prices for some time. A young man with a furrowed brow said the mayor's office was promoting the tourism project as the only way out of the crisis, offering no real alternatives. People also mentioned that if investors came in, land prices could skyrocket, leaving local residents without their traditional means of survival. Diego took notes on every testimony. He understood that if Andrew signed any agreement with Matthew, he would be legitimizing a plan that could further impoverish the townspeople or even force them to leave. It wasn't just about crossing the bridge to save Alice's life. Whatever decision Andrew made would directly affect the future of hundreds of families. At that point, the lawyer felt compelled to share all this information with his client, knowing full well that the girl's health was a priority, but also that the social and ethical consequences of giving in to Matthew's blackmail could not be ignored. When Diego explained the conclusions of these meetings to Andrew, the businessman experienced a painful inner conflict. On the one hand, he desperately wanted to save Alice. The child's condition worsened every passing day without specialized care, and the thought of losing her right when he'd finally found her was unbearable. On the other hand, he knew that if he gave in to the mayor's demands, he would be betraying the trust and efforts of a community struggling against drought and poverty. Caroline, who witnessed all these dilemmas, showed more understanding than usual. Even with her own doubts about the future of her relationship with Andrew, she couldn't ignore the suffering of Ezekiel and the threat looming over the entire town because of Matthew's maneuverings. The young woman tried to comfort Andrew, urging him to look for another way to cross the river without harming the community. Despite the urgency, there just might be an alternative path no one had considered yet. Although entirely focused on caring for Alice, Ezekiel heard about Andrew's predicament. Realizing the man wanted to save his daughter, but also avoid crushing an entire community's hopes, the old man began outlining an idea. There was a little used river crossing once employed to move livestock when the main bridge was under repair. It was a long, dangerous route, especially with the river swollen by recent storms, but it could be their only chance to reach the hospital in time without yielding to blackmail. Thus, in Beatrice's restaurant and along the town's waterlogged streets, word began to spread that there might be a third option, a way to safeguard Alice's life and at the same time preserve the dignity of the people who lived there. Meanwhile, Matthew remained certain that Andrew would end up giving in, never imagining that community opposition would continue to gain momentum. With a crucial decision looming, the destinies of both Alice and all the local farmers were about to be decided in a tense clash of wills. At dawn the next day, while mist still clung to the town, Andrew, Ezekiel, and Diego gathered in the back patio of Beatrice's restaurant to finalize their plan. They had chosen to use that old river crossing, which didn't rely on the main bridge, hoping to reach the city hospital before Alice's condition deteriorated further. The sky remained overcast with grey clouds, though the storm seemed to have calmed enough to grant them a small reprieve. Exhausted from his sleepless nights, Ezekiel held Alice in his arms. The girl was wrapped in a thick blanket that barely revealed her feverish face. Her eyelids fluttered occasionally, and in her few lucid moments, she clung to the old man's calloused hand. The fever had not subsided, and each passing minute increased the urgency of getting her to a facility with better medical resources. Ever cautious, Diego carried a small briefcase containing documents that might be useful should any legal snags arise. He also had some emergency medications and bandages on hand. Nearby, Andrew checked the water jugs and tried to maintain his composure, despite the palpable tension. His fear of losing his daughter mixed with the determination to save her at any cost. A small group of townspeople, informed by Beatrice about the situation, offered their help. Among them was José, a muscular fisherman who knew the river well and trusted his own experience to handle a small wooden boat, even with the swift current. Miguel, a young farmer, also volunteered, willing to row against the odds. With these volunteers, they organized an improvised caravan that would travel to the riverbank, beyond the section of bridge that had been destroyed. The journey to the riverbank was a challenge in itself. The ground, still muddy from the recent rains, made every step unpredictable. Ezekiel, carrying Alice, moved slowly, doing his best to keep her still in her delirious state. Andrew walked beside him, offering an arm whenever the old man slipped. Diego followed behind, watching out for obstacles, while the townspeople carried oars and jugs, covered with tarps to protect them from the damp. Upon reaching the shore, they found the river swollen and murky. The current roared, as if warning them of the dangers hidden beneath its surface. Their boat, made of reinforced planks, bucked against the bank. Yet José remained sure he could steer it if everyone followed his instructions. The fisherman reminded them they had to balance their weight so they wouldn't capsize in the middle of the rushing water. With utmost care, they placed Alice on a makeshift seat in the center of the boat. Ezekiel and Andrew settled next to her, holding her from both sides to keep her from swaying too much. Diego positioned himself at the back, in charge of keeping their belongings safe. José and Miguel stationed themselves at opposite ends, ready to row in unison as soon as they reached the main current. The boat slid slowly away from the bank, and the water immediately pummeled it. The river had burst its banks in several areas, sometimes making it difficult to see where the current ended and solid ground began. Drifting branches frequently crossed their path, forcing quick maneuvers to avoid them. Each sharp turn sent the boat lurching, and the passengers clung desperately to the sides. On one of the roughest stretches, the boat tilted dangerously. Caught off balance by Alice's weight, Ezekiel nearly fell overboard. A chorus of shouts rang out as the old man lost his footing and let go of the blanket that covered the girl for an instant. Andrew reacted at once, grabbing him around the waist and setting him upright just in time. The cold water sprayed fiercely, drenching them all. Alice, semi-conscious, let out a faint groan. She seemed not to fully understand what was happening, but clutched Ezekiel's hand and refused to let go. As the boat regained stability, Andrew and Ezekiel exchanged glances laden with shared anxiety. They had never imagined they'd be together on such a perilous journey, but the child's fate and survival were on the line. The little one, her cheeks flushed with fever, felt the warmth of Ezekiel's hand and the fleeting relief of Andrew's hand gently touching her forehead, checking her temperature. José and Miguel, focused on rowing and steering clear of whirlpools, never stopped calling out instructions so no one would move needlessly. Every time the boat listed, the passengers' desire to reach the hospital grew stronger. It was as if the raging river were testing the unity of everyone involved in that voyage. After pushing through the current for a long stretch, the opposite bank finally came into view. They spotted a makeshift dock that, according to José, would let them disembark and continue overland to the main road. Relief mingled with caution. They still had several yards of turbulent water left. Even so, the prospect of getting closer to the city and the medical care they so urgently needed gave the rowers one last boost of energy. Amid the spray, shouts of encouragement, and the pounding of their hearts, the boat finally ran aground with a jolt on the muddy bank. Ezekiel, clutching Alice, was the first to step onto firm land, his legs shaking and his spirit weighed down. Andrew followed close behind, holding tight to the blanket that enveloped the girl. Diego and the others quickly set about securing the boat and retrieving their gear as the sun cautiously peeked through the clouds. With the boat behind them and the road to the city up ahead, they knew they had overcome the most treacherous part of the crossing. They still had the final stretch to the hospital, where every minute would count in saving Alice's life. Speaking only the bare necessities, they got ready to continue in a vehicle the locals had promised to lend them. The river was now behind them, but the fight for the girl's health was only beginning. The pickup truck carrying them from the riverbank to the city crawled along a road riddled with potholes and makeshift detours. Still, after several hours of jolts and shocks, Ezekiel, Andrew, and Diego finally glimpsed the dim lights of a small hospital on the outskirts of the urban area. Weariness pressed down on their shoulders, and the tension was palpable in their every move. They barely had time to stop the vehicle in front of the emergency entrance before paramedics came out with a stretcher. Ezekiel, holding Alice with near-sacred care, let them take her. A torrent of rushed explanations followed, an unrelenting fever, recent seizures, and a diagnosis no one in town had been able to pinpoint. Hearing such ominous signs, the doctors decided to move the girl to the intensive care unit immediately. As they wheeled Alice away, Ezekiel stood frozen for a few seconds, staring at the door of the unit as it closed behind the stretcher. A sudden trembling overtook his legs, and Andrew noticed the old man was on the verge of collapse, worn down by exhaustion and dread. Without hesitation, he hurried to steady him, guiding him to the waiting room and finding 2 metal chairs. There, Ezekiel sank down, still covered in dried mud that he hadn't been able to wash off during the trip. Andrew sat beside him, paying no mind to the filth on his own clothes. The silence settling between them did not arise from a lack of topics to discuss, but rather from a deep shock. They shared the same worry and were bound by the fear of losing the child who, each in his own way, played a vital role in their lives. Ezekiel felt that, despite his initial suspicions and accusations, Andrew had become a support in that agonizing struggle against Alice's illness. Diego, the lawyer, shouldered the administrative and financial tasks. Phone in hand, he paced the corridor, talking to secretaries and coordinators. He needed to ensure that the treatment costs and any tests the girl required were covered immediately. From time to time, he glanced over at Ezekiel and Andrew, pondering the image of 2 very different men now seated side by side, facing the same uncertain fate. Caroline arrived shortly after, carrying a bag with clean clothes and a small thermos of hot coffee. She had battled the city's chaotic traffic to gather supplies they might need, from blankets to light meals. Seeing Andrew and Ezekiel, she realized the journey had been far more exhausting than she'd imagined. She offered them the items and stood quietly, noticing the weariness etched into their faces. "I brought a bit of food and something to drink," she said softly. "It's not much, but it'll help you recover your strength." Ezekiel eyed her gratefully and took a sip of the coffee, barely noticing its taste as his thoughts revolved around Alice. Andrew, for his part, thanked her with a gentle squeeze of her hand. It was the first time he had seen her so willing to get involved without reservations in the matter of the little girl. Until then, Caroline had harbored reservations. Understandable, given how delicate this situation was, threatening to derail their wedding plans. But the gravity of events seemed to have awakened in her a sense of solidarity she hadn't known she possessed. Hours passed without any doctor coming out to give news. The hospital's cold lights, combined with the hum of fluorescent tubes, reinforced the impression that time stood still. Ezekiel kept fidgeting with his fingers, recalling the first day he saw the child abandoned by the river. Andrew, immersed in his own thoughts, wondered if he would be able to make up for lost time with his daughter, now that he'd found her teetering on the edge. Caroline went up to Diego, anxious to confirm that all the paperwork was in order, and the lawyer assured her he had arranged sufficient financial guarantees to begin treatment without delay. In that waiting room, stifled by uncertainty, the bond between Ezekiel and Andrew grew stronger in silence. Both knew Alice's rescue was their priority, and that everything else, Matthew's schemes, their paternity dispute, the tourism project, could wait. That frail girl dozing in intensive care, hooked to machines and surrounded by diligent medical staff, was uniting the lives of two men who had, until recently, eyed each other with mistrust. Now they shared the same prayer, entrusting themselves to the hope of a favorable outcome. Alice's fever began to subside after several days of intensive treatment. Under the watchful eyes of nurses and doctors, the girl made gradual progress. The seizure that had so alarmed them did not recur, and her temperature stabilized within safe limits. This brought relief to the group, waiting anxiously in the corridor. Ezekiel and Andrew, exhausted but grateful, drew closer than ever, sharing silent moments of mutual reassurance and reflections they had not been able to voice before. On one of those long days, when Caroline and Diego had momentarily gone to the hospital cafeteria, the old man and the businessman found themselves alone in the hallway. After a few seconds of hesitation, Ezekiel took the initiative to talk. In a grave, measured tone, he told Andrew how he had shielded Alice from the night he found her abandoned by a dark river. He spoke of the hardships he faced, lacking money and contending with drought to provide the girl with shelter and food. Every word carried the weight of years, the guilt of never having discovered the child's true origins, and the hope that everything would someday become clear. Andrew, in turn, listened in silence, recalling countless instances of poring over old records, newspaper clippings, and false leads that led him to dead ends. He explained that he had never stopped searching, consumed by uncertainty over whether his daughter was alive or in unknown hands. He remembered the sleepless nights he spent haunted by the memory of that baby with a birthmark on her left arm, the same one he himself had seen when she was born. With each memory he shared, Andrew felt his initial anger toward Ezekiel dissolve, realizing that the old man had stood in for him all those years with devotion and love. Their hours of conversation proved cathartic. The lingering mistrust that had stained their earlier encounters gave way as they recognized they both cared deeply for the same girl. Their only difference lay in how each had come to her. Andrew through his biological rights as her father, and Ezekiel by compassion, offering shelter to a defenseless child. Although they still hadn't agreed on what would happen next, nor who would have custody of Alice, simply expressing themselves without shouts or blame brought them closer to a place of mutual respect. Caroline returned that evening, looking worn out by her own tensions. She found Ezekiel calmer than before, having apparently moved beyond the hostility he had once shown her. When he saw her, he offered her a seat next to him, and she opened up. She admitted fearing how Alice's presence might alter her plans with Andrew, as she didn't feel ready for a child. Yet she acknowledged that the girl needed a father, and that it was only fair to let them know each other. With unexpected calm, Ezekiel assured her that a child's love need not destroy other bonds. He spoke of how the heart can expand to hold new affections, and that Alice did not come to push her aside, but rather to find a place where she could receive the family she had been denied. Caroline seemed relieved. She nodded with a slight sigh, gazing toward the door that led to the girls' room, as if she were finally able to regard Alice without misgivings, but with genuine compassion. Marina also arrived, more composed now after the intense revelations she had shared back in the town. She felt that by recounting every detail she remembered about Alice's mother, she was finally clearing a debt she owed both to herself and to the Brown family. Neither Ezekiel nor Andrew bore her any resentment. They realized that she too had been a victim of circumstance and of the fears surrounding the girl's mother. As time passed, the housekeeper felt the burden she'd carried for years lift, leaving her freer, more willing to mend what lay in her power. Thus, in the midst of medical bustle and the hospital's endless hallways, the bonds among them all shifted. Ezekiel and Andrew found a quiet empathy manifest in each encouraging glance and comforting hand on the shoulder. Caroline discovered an inner solidarity she never knew she had, and Marina finally achieved a release from her own regrets. Meanwhile, as Alice's fever at last vanished completely and her breathing stabilized under the doctor's watchful care, so too grew the hope that when she left the hospital, both the little girl and those around her could begin weaving a new path toward reconciliation. While the days passed in the hospital, with Alice still on the mend, the town she had fallen ill in was not sitting idle before Matthew's schemes. Beatrice, armed with her characteristic resolve, gathered several farmers and neighbors to file complaints about the mayor's irregularities with regional authorities. For weeks, she had collected testimonies from people who had been pressured to sell their lands at unfair prices. She also had the support of Diego, who, after witnessing Matthew's methods firsthand, decided to provide copies of documents that exposed the shady deals the mayor was trying to seal. The town's atmosphere gradually changed. Before, many felt powerless, certain that Matthew's promises of development were the only option for escaping the crisis brought on by drought. Now, spurred by Beatrice's new push for action, that collective resignation was beginning to crumble. Small assemblies met in her restaurant, where, with Diego's legal insights, townspeople learned about their rights and how to legally oppose the development project. It was at one of these gatherings that the extent of Matthew's coercion came to light. Several farmers confessed to having received intimidating visits from so-called investors. Word spread that the mayor had played along in exchange for a hefty commission, intending to sell the land to the tourism company at a price far above what he had offered the residents. That way, he expected to reap a massive personal profit, exploiting the town's need for money and water. The documents Diego had kept were decisive. Copies of preliminary contracts and letters on mayoral letterhead demonstrated that Matthew was engaged in near-extortion practices. These records, combined with the community's statements, formed a solid basis for regional officials to launch a formal inquiry. As days went by, legal pressure intensified, and little by little Matthew found himself forced to answer to inspectors who arrived from the capital, alarmed by the irregularities. Camps of farmers and laborers sprang up on the outskirts of town, blocking access roads to the plots the mayor intended to sell. Hastily painted signs condemning corruption dotted the streets. At last, people experienced a unity they had so long lacked during the drought. Men and women who had once suffered in silence now raised their voices for justice, inspired by the example of Beatrice and other committed neighbors. Amid protests and allegations, the regional authorities issued an official statement that the tourism project was suspended immediately pending clarification of all accusations. Cornered, Matthew tried to dismiss the charges, blaming political opponents for carrying out a witch hunt. But the accumulated evidence provided by Diego and the testimonies of those who had faced threats undercut any possible defense from the mayor. A few days later, the regional prosecutor issued an order removing Matthew from office for the duration of the judicial investigation. That decision sparked an outburst of jubilation in the town. Men who had lost their crops, women who feared for their children's future, and young people who saw their job opportunities dwindle finally felt that justice was being served. The supposed development project collapsed, as it no longer had local authority backing nor access to the low-cost lands Matthew had promised. The so-called investors disappeared the moment the illicit guarantees offered by the mayor vanished. With the real estate scheme halted, a sense of collective relief spread through the town. Still, many wondered what would happen next. The drought remained a latent threat, and the need for long-term solutions was as pressing as ever. Beatrice, worn out yet satisfied, returned to her work at the restaurant, where conversations now went beyond hardship to highlight the importance of neighborly solidarity. She herself felt hopeful, knowing she wouldn't have to cave into extortion to keep her small business afloat. Meanwhile, in the hospital, Alice's struggle to recover coincided with the town's victory. Ezekiel and Andrew, learning of these events through Diego's calls, quietly celebrated Matthew's downfall. Though they still worried about the girl's health, they took comfort in knowing that the place where she had grown up would not fall into unscrupulous hands. In that way, everyone's efforts, both inside and outside the town, ultimately saved not only Alice, but also a community that faced adversity with dignity. Thus, with Matthew forced to account for his actions and the project on hold, a new outlook emerged. People realized that in difficult times, unity and resistance could change the course of history. And while they still had many challenges ahead, the town celebrated the corrupt mayor's fall as a significant victory in defending their lands, their homes, and their identity. One bright morning, when most of the group was waiting in the reception area or in the hallway next to Alice's room, the doctors made their announcement. The tired yet alert faces of Ezekiel, Andrew, and Caroline lit up at the news that the little girl was finally out of danger. Her fever had subsided for good, and test results showed that her body was responding to treatment. Although she would need periodic checkups and costly medication to prevent relapses, the threat of losing her had all but vanished. Ezekiel, his eyes red from countless sleepless nights, dropped into one of the metal chairs, tears streaming down his face, a mix of relief and gratitude. A huge burden lifted from his shoulders, as though waking from a terrible nightmare. He felt Alice's presence in every heartbeat, and realizing she would stay by his side, gave him the strength to stand up and thank the doctors in person. Then he returned to share the good news with Andrew and Caroline. Andrew watched the emotional old man, fully aware of the fortitude and love that had kept him going during those uncertain days. With a lump in his throat, he recalled all the times he had imagined rescuing his daughter from non-existent perils. Now that they had a real chance for a future together, he felt the urge to protect her and provide what he hadn't been able to before. Without hesitation, he offered to cover all medical costs and to formally recognize Alice's paternity straight away. Caroline, who in the past might have hesitated or responded coldly, surprised even herself by supporting the idea wholeheartedly. Throughout the ordeal with Alice, she had come to see that love does not get divided, but rather multiplied. The girl needed stability, affection, and strong ties to help her grow up healthy and happy. If Andrew wished to be an active, responsible father, she wouldn't stand in his way. On the contrary, she was prepared to accept Alice as part of the family she planned to build with him. Ezekiel listened to the proposal with a jumble of emotions. Happiness at the security Andrew offered, fear of being sidelined, and deep uncertainty about the future. He had cared for the girl from the moment he found her abandoned, giving her what little he had. It pained him to think that once Andrew's paternity became official, Alice might drift away from his modest country home. However, he understood that the child deserved the right to know and spend time with her biological father, especially now that fate had allowed them to meet again. After discussing it among themselves and seeking Diego's advice on the legal details, they agreed on a plan that worked for everyone. Andrew would formally claim paternity so he could provide Alice with the medical attention she required. At the same time, Ezekiel's vital and irreplaceable bond with her would be recognized, allowing her to keep living with him in the countryside, but receiving frequent visits from Andrew and ongoing financial support. In this way, Alice would not lose the environment she knew as home, nor the old man who had saved her, yet she would also gain the presence of her biological father. When they presented the plan, Ezekiel hesitated briefly, the memory of that stormy night when he first cradled the baby in damp blankets still fresh in his mind. But looking into Andrew's eyes, he recognized the man's sincerity. He did not mean to tear Alice away from him. Instead, he wanted to formally share that bond Ezekiel and the girl already had. So, the old man nodded gently, his eyes brimming with tears once more. "We'll have a lot to work out," he murmured, "but Alice deserves the truth. I never wanted to lie to her about where she came from. I only wanted to keep her safe." Visibly moved, Andrew set a hand on Ezekiel's shoulder. He promised that once back in town, he would see to it that the girl had everything she needed: medicines, clothes, food, and schooling. Likewise, he would respect the lifestyle Alice was used to and wouldn't pressure her to adapt to city life if she didn't want to. Caroline even suggested they spend periods in the countryside so that the girl would not feel forced to choose between two different worlds. When Alice woke up, still convalescent and a bit groggy from the medication, she found Ezekiel at her side, holding her hand, and Andrew standing near the edge of the bed, smiling at her tenderly. Though she didn't yet fully grasp the magnitude of the changes ahead, she sensed the peaceful, united atmosphere around her. Without saying much, she lay back down, feeling calmer than she had in days. Thus, amid whispered promises and gentle smiles, Alice's recovery ushered in a new chapter. A chapter in which she could receive the love of both the one who rescued her and the one who brought her into this world without having to give up any part of her roots. At last reconciled with the story that bound them, Ezekiel and Andrew resolved to put aside distrust and bitterness. And Caroline, her heart more open than ever, prepared to walk alongside them, knowing that Alice's presence could bring them together in ways they'd never imagined. A few days later, with her discharge papers signed, Alice left the hospital accompanied by Ezekiel and Andrew. Though she walked slowly, still recovering and wearing a bandage over the spot where her IV had been, her eyes shone with renewed joy. With each step, she felt the comforting support of the two people who had become her most important pillars. The old man, beaming, offered a steadying arm, while Andrew, taking her by the hand, gently reminded her that from that day forward, they would be together forever. The journey back to town took place under an air of hope. Although the road still showed the effects of the recent rains, nobody seemed concerned about potholes or puddles. In the back seat, Alice gazed at the scenery with new eyes, as though her near brush with serious illness had given her the ability to cherish every detail. Her biological father, sitting beside her, offered words of encouragement, while Ezekiel, up front, glanced back from time to time, silently grateful for the chance to keep looking after her. When they crossed the town's limits, they were met by an unexpected welcome. Upon hearing that the girl's condition had improved, the townsfolk organized a small celebration at Beatrice's restaurant. Soon after they stopped the vehicle, Ezekiel and Andrew looked on in surprise at the joyful faces gathered there to cheer Alice's arrival. Children raced through the central plaza carrying balloons, and the church bells rang with a note of festivity. Beatrice, beaming, came out to greet them. With help from a few friends, she had prepared simple yet flavorful dishes to honor the girl and to celebrate that the speculative project threatening their lands had collapsed. People felt that, in some way, Alice's recovery symbolized the collective strength of the community, which had banded together to foil the ambitions of Matthew and his investors. Caroline, who had traveled in another vehicle with Diego, showed up moments later. Her eyes lit up as she took in the festive mood. She immediately walked over to greet Ezekiel and Andrew and gently stroked Alice's cheek, noticing how much color she had regained. Although at first it was hard for Caroline to imagine her life split between the city and this remote place, she realized there were ways to reconcile both worlds, as long as love and a willingness to shape a different kind of family, one full of sincere affection, prevailed. Meanwhile, Marina, the former brown housekeeper, breathed a sigh of relief at seeing the child take steady steps across the restaurant threshold. Through her revelations about the past, Ezekiel and Andrew had been able to bridge the wall of resentment dividing them. She no longer felt the weight of guilt for having kept quiet all that time. At last, her conscience was at peace, convinced that all the pieces had fallen into their rightful place. Improvised music on guitar and drum echoed through the restaurant, where neighbors, smiling and supportive, crowded around the tables. The hum of chatter and laughter blended with the aroma of the food Beatrice had prepared as she bustled about tending to her guests. Ezekiel and Andrew, with Alice seated next to them, received congratulations, hugs, and praise for their courage and persistence. In the midst of this festive atmosphere, the child soon recovered some of her usual energy. Though she tired quickly, she showed signs of wanting to return to her games and the everyday routines she had put on hold. Everyone was moved by the sight of Alice smiling, her arms still bandaged, her eyes bright with life. She stood as a reminder of the trials they had all overcome. At the end of the celebration, Ezekiel led Alice and Andrew to his humble home. The ground in the yard, still damp from the storm, was starting to show signs of fertility, tiny green shoots emerging among the cracks in the soil. Alice, laughing happily, ran to examine the plants, though she tired quickly. Watching her, Andrew realized that, for all its rustic simplicity, this place was irreplaceable. It was here that the girl had grown up and developed her spirit. Standing beside Andrew, Ezekiel gazed at the child with tender eyes. He remembered the rainy night when he'd found her, just a baby, and the silent promise he made to protect her always. Next to him, Andrew thought about all those years he had spent searching, feeling an emptiness that now seemed filled by that very scene. Both men agreed that the past, with its shadows and mysteries, had been eclipsed by the power of the present, where Alice shone with her own special light. That day marked the beginning of a fairer era for everyone. With Matthew removed from office and the town regaining hope, the Rains left behind a renewed breath of life. The future was still uncertain, yet brimming with promise. The fields might grow lush again, community-based projects might flourish, and Alice would continue to blossom under the shared care of Ezekiel and Andrew. The damp earth, symbol of a life pushing forward after the storm, represented the girl's rebirth and that of the community around her. And so, on that peaceful morning brimming with gratitude, Alice ran about the yard, while her two fathers followed her with their eyes. The old man who had rescued her and the man who had given her life put their conflicts behind them, realizing that their shared love for the child was enough to keep them united.